to quote your old buddy Brian Kelly, when he's asked about expectations at LSU, he seems to lean in the direction of, he always goes back to, well, the roster's not where we expected to be down the road. We're still filling it in. We took over a mess. We took over a roster void of talent, void of depth, and we're still filling it out and getting it to where we need it to be. And once you start to bring up the weather, as I did, and then you start to give us some context to that and how you prepare the roster for a big game against a big opponent in those conditions, I think, okay, where does Notre Dame stand in regards to where you would want them to be? Obviously, Brian Kelly turned over a pretty good roster over to Marcus Freeman a couple of years ago, but is this a roster where it needs to be overall from a depth standpoint?
Depth standpoint, absolutely. I mean, I was actually talking about that on the show today, Mark, is you look at Brian Kelly in year 3 and Marcus Freeman in year 3 and how much more of this roster is guys that he's brought in compared to what Brian Kelly had in 2012. There was still a very heavy, Charlie Weiss recruit influence on that class. And part of it is just the changes in college football since then. I mean, Brian Kelly couldn't go to the portal and get a Riley Leonard and a Chris Mitchell and RJ Oben and Rod Hurd and players like that. They had to say, okay, well, we're down a corner. We're not great at corner. I didn't inherit a great corner situation from my predecessor beyond some guys that were vets. Can't go to the portal and get them. I got to move Kavari Russell over there and get him ready to go. You had to kind of build it from within. And Marcus Freeman has taken advantage of that. They've had 2 very good sized and talented recruiting classes in 23 and 24. Notre Dame has, I believe I counted 8 true freshmen in their 2 deep, basically in their depth chart today, and a lot of other redshirt freshmen. You look at the offensive line, they've got 1 true freshman starting on the offensive line, and they've got Sam Pendleton, who's a redshirt freshman, second-year player, and then 3 guys who are redshirt sophomores. But the depth behind it is very good. You've got Pat Coogan, Rocco Spindler, Chris Tarrick, Sullivan Absher inside. So there's Joe Otting, there's great depth there. And if your tackles struggle, you've got Tosh Baker to rely on, who's got 4 career starts. You've got Gerby Lambert, who's a guy that is a 5-star recruit coming into Notre Dame. So even up front on the offensive line, where there's a lot of concerns about the youth and inexperience, it is a very deep group. And same with wide receiver. I don't know if they've got a number 1 guy there, but I know they have a lot of guys there that are talented and good football players. And it's true everywhere. You can lose a guy like Cam Hart to the NFL, and you've got Christian Gray and Jaden Mickey stepping into battle, and you've got Leonard Moore coming in to compete there. So they're at the point now, Mark, where it's reload mode. And in Brian Kelly's defense, the reality is he did inherit a much different roster at LSU than what Marcus Freeman walked into at Notre Dame. I understand all that, but he's always going to kind of have that mantra. But Notre Dame didn't have to completely rebuild the numbers. So as they went out and recruited, they were adding on to what was already there. And they've also, to the point where they've kind of funneled some guys out of the program this last couple of years because they've been able to go out and get better players. And that's something that the high school recruiting and the portal's really done for this program.
Yeah, the depth situation, which leads us into this question. So, of course, Joe Alt onto the Chargers as a first-round pick. And then the injury that was talked about more so than any other injury probably during this entire training camp across the nation was at left tackle as well. So size up the situation along the offensive front and the weaknesses and where you think Notre Dame has been able to maybe fill the gap and what they need to do there in terms of the offensive line shuffle.
I thought Mike Elko had a great comment on that today during this press conference. He goes, listen, if a freshman's playing offensive line for Notre Dame, it means he's going to be high. He's going to be a high draft pick in a few years. And to a degree, there's some truth to that. But this is in the last true freshman offensive lineman that started at Notre Dame was Joe Alt. He was thrust into the starting lineup. The guy that they started that year off was Blake Fisher. He was a true freshman starting offensive lineman, but it's never ideal, right? There's certain positions, Mark, where I honestly just don't care about experience. I don't care about experience at running back. If you can play, you can play. I don't care about experience, but at receiver. But when you talk about offensive line, experience does matter more to me. So there's this unique balance that you have to have if you're going to evaluate properly this offensive line. You can take the stance of, hey, it's all about the talent. And okay, that's true. Emil Wagner's a very talented player. I gave him a 5-star upside grade. And Anthony Knapp is a very talented player. I gave a 4.5-star upside grade too. Same with Sam Pendleton, same with Billy Stroud, same with Ashton Craig. These are all very talented players. But it's also a position where experience matters more than any other position on offense outside of quarterback. Those two are right up there. And the experience matters for two reasons. Number one is obviously the experience of playing. You know what to expect. You've seen all the looks. You've seen all the stunts. You know how to read certain things. When an defensive lineman's lining up this way and his body's tilted a little bit this way, you know that means he's going to do this. Where a younger player doesn't have those nuances that a veteran player would have. It's the experience of playing together. Offensive line, more than anything else, is like a dance, right? It's like a symphony. You've got to all be playing the same note at the same time. It's all got to kind of, the timing's got to be perfect. If you're a person playing the clarinet or person playing the saxophone is off, everybody in the building knows that that person's off. The timing is off, right? It's the same thing here when it comes to offensive line. If your left guard is off, when it comes to the timing of what he needs to do, whether it's working the second level, back blocking, whatever the case may be, everybody's going to know it because you get exposed on the offensive line. And so that's another level of experience. And the other part of experience is grown man strength, right? I mean, the older you are, the stronger you get, the more you have sort of that grown-up strength. Why do they say you shouldn't have NFL players playing against college players? Because there's just a different kind of strength. And so that factors into it as well. So which side of that debate wins on Saturday night, Mark? That's going to be the question. Does the talent take over for Notre Dame, the athleticism, the length, the ability to go out there and run the football, or is it going to be more about the experience or the lack thereof? Which is the talking point coming out of the game? Boy, that's a really talented offensive line, or boy, those young guys, they got a long way to go. I think that's going to have more than anything, the biggest impact on how this game is going to play out this weekend.
So since we went offensive line on the Notre Dame side, let's go back there because in your scouting of Texas A&M, and Mike Elko has something to do with this, even though he just arrived as the head coach. Of course, as defensive coordinator, did a great job forming one of the great front sevens in college football, even though they were losing roughly 4 games a year under Jimbo Fisher. It typically wasn't because of the front seven on defense. They were really stout there and were again last year. Is that your number one cause of concern? Because before you school me here, that would be mine if I'm Notre Dame, would be offensive line versus blocking their front.
So sometimes, Mark, when you're schooling somebody, you got to correct them and show them the error of their ways, right? Sometimes it's well done. Well done, sir. That's the biggest one right there. I mean, that was my biggest concern before Charles Jagasaw got hurt. It'd be my biggest concern if Joe Alt and Blake Fisher both came back. I mean, that is the strength of this football team. And they returned talent that was already there. They did lose some players of the portal. Walter Nolan left. Anthony Lucas left 2 years ago. Fidel Diggs left for Syracuse. But then they replaced those guys with Nick Scourton, who's better than anybody that left. There's still plenty of talented players coming back. There's some kids that have transferred in. I think it's important nowadays on the D line, especially now in this era of, you've got to win 15, 16 games. And if you play in your conference title game and lose, you've got to play 17 games to win a championship. Depth is of the utmost importance. One of the things I love about the Notre Dame D line, Mark, is they can throw waves at you. I mean, they're not just the starters, and after that, there's a big drop-off. They can throw waves of playmakers, and A&M's very similar. Yes, their starting lineup is very good, but they've got guys that can move around. Shamar Turner can play inside. He can play outside. You've got Nick Scourton, who's a dynamic player off the edge. You've got guys coming off the bench. I mean, Rodis Johnson transfers in from Wisconsin. He's a solid football player. Wisconsin. He's second, third string for them now. Again, they're just going to be able to throw a lot of people at you, and that's really the key to having a talented defensive line is, okay, defensive linemen can't play 95% of the snaps like a cornerback can. They have to have some sort of rotation. And when there's a big drop-off between 1 and 2, that's how you can get beat. And that's not the case for this Texas A&M D line, and it's not the case for the Notre Dame defensive line. That's absolutely my biggest concern. It's a talented but very young, inexperienced, and not massive Notre Dame offensive line. It's also a very athletic offensive line going against a very physical, big, experienced defensive line that I think 3 of the expected starters are returners. So they're not exactly like Florida State was dealing with some of their position groups yesterday. Like you're looking at other teams, like A&M is doing it at some other spots. Like A&M has got a completely revamped roster on the second and third levels. Whole bunch of new DBs coming over from Kansas State and Incarnate Word and all these other, Central Michigan, all these places. But their D line outside of Scourton in the starting lineup are guys that have been there. And so I think that's something that benefits them. And how well Notre Dame holds up against that group is ultimately, I believe, going to be the thing that determines if Notre Dame can or can't win this football game or win this particular matchup in this football game.
So, Brian, getting to my next point, it leads me to like a 9-6 ball game, because looking at the Texas A&M offensive line during the Kevin Sumlin years, they were churning out, especially at left tackle, excellent offensive lines. And again, first rounders at left tackle into the Jimbo Fisher era. So that's something that surprised me about how bad they were along the offensive front last year. And they only brought back one starter, and he wasn't a great player, but a stable guy. So when you look at Notre Dame and what they bring defensively versus Texas A&M and the struggles that they had last year and are going to try to show that they fixed, is this Notre Dame defensive line pretty much smelling blood?
Well, I would hope so. I mean, that's been sort of my frustration this offseason, Mark, has been this notion that all everybody wants to talk about is the matchup between the Notre Dame offensive line and the Texas A&M defensive line. And for good reason. I don't have a problem with people wanting to talk about that matchup. But then there's just a complete ignoring the fact that, hey, there's this pretty important matchup on the other side of the ball too, that has a Notre Dame defensive line that was one of the nation's best last year. And this isn't even just my opinion. You can go look at analysts and people that cover the sport that aren't, if you perceive me to have a Notre Dame bias, that say, hey, look, it's Michigan's combination of Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant and Notre Dame's combination of Riley Mills and Howard Cross. They're the two best, defensive tackle tandems coming back in college football. And then you land R.J. Oben, who was a very productive pass rusher at Duke for the last few years, got coached by Mike Elko and prepared by Mike Elko. Jordan Patelho returns. And then, of course, Marcus Freeman recruiting is what's going to fill out the depth chart. And that's one of the things I've talked about with this group is, we're going to find out this year just how good of a coach or recruiter that Marcus Freeman is, because so much of the depth chart is being filled by guys that were Marcus Freeman recruits. And so if they're as good as we think they are and hope that they are, if you're a Notre Dame fan, then that's going to add to it as well. When you look at guys like, Boubacar Traore and Josh Burnham and Bryce Young and players like that. So, how they handle themselves is going to go a long way towards this matchup. And as you mentioned, Texas A&M was not a great offensive line last season. They do have two new starters. They got a kid from Kansas, Armaj Reed Adams, who was a good big player and a good player at Kansas last year. They got Kalinu, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, from Utah at center, 6'3", 330. Adds a lot of size to the mix. Chase Pasantis was a freshman All-American last year. He's back. And then the question is going to be what happens at tackle, because Ruben Feathery was their starter there last year, and he's injured, so he's probably not going to play much, or at least won't start. We've got Demetrius Crownover starting there now, and then, of course, Trey Zune's coming back at left tackle. So they should be better than they were last year. The question is how quickly can they gel, right? Like everything I just talked about with Notre Dame, about you've got these new guys, and they've got to come together and play together. Well, you're looking at Texas A&M. They've got two transfers who are starting on the offensive line. You got a new guy at right tackle. And how are they going to be able to come together? How will they gel together and play against what is a really good defensive line? And so that's why I say that's the matchup on both sides of the ball, is whose offensive line can hold up the best against the other team's defensive line. And that's going to be a big key. And then on top of that, how do you handle it? These are two really smart defensive coaches. Mike Elko, obviously, for the Duke team. You've got Al Golden for Notre Dame. How do they handle the pressure packages? How do they handle where they're bringing backers from? And Elko likes to bring corner fires and nickel fires and safety fires and things along those lines. Does Notre Dame's lineman and quarterback handle that stuff really well? And how does having Riley Leonard give you an advantage? I was asked this a couple weeks ago, Mark. Are you worried about the advantage that Mike Elko has of playing? He knows Riley Leonard, and I said I actually think in a lot of cases it's the player that has more of the advantage than the coach. And Mike Elko nailed that answer today. He said, "Look, yeah, we know what he did in our system, but like we're not familiar with what he's going to do in that system. He knows who we are. He knows what we do." And I thought that was a very interesting answer as well, because how can Riley Leonard help you recognizing some of those things that he's seen 1,000 times? Like, okay, that safety starts doing this. It usually means this. Will that be an advantage at all? Will they try to use that to their advantage by trying to maybe bait Riley Leonard into some mistakes, showing things that they know are tendencies? That part of the matchup is going to be fascinating. But at the end of the day, Mark, it's what happens in the trenches on both sides of the ball is going to be, to me, the biggest determiner of who wins this game outside of the things like turnovers and things along those lines.
I'm really going to watch this quarterback for Notre Dame on Saturday night, because I certainly had a certain perception of who he was or could be as a baller, a gamer, use your cliche, gym rat kind of guy, lays it all on the line, does whatever he needs to win. And sometimes those guys, if they display that kind of leadership and that kind of grit, well, that's because they don't have enough talent. They got to show that. They have to be that guy. Well, you can be both. You can have really good talent and also have a fiery spirit and do everything you possibly can to win. And Riley Leonard, even in this chat, has taken some shots as being like the next Tyler Buchner. But you're telling me different in regards to being able to make the throws.
That's the key, right? I mean, he's a guy that absolutely has a more proven track record than what Tyler Buchner did as a passer. And you look at his first season at Duke, there's some things he's going to have to improve on. One of the things I've talked a lot about is he's going to have to be a little bit more accurate hitting the deep ball. There's some games he's really on. We saw that 2 years ago when they played at Kansas. He was excellent throwing the deep ball, goes 24 of 35, 324 yards, and they lose a shootout to Jalen Daniels and that Kansas team. We saw him against North Carolina that year, absolutely rip up that North Carolina defense throwing the football. Did the same thing when he outdueled Sam Hartman that year, went 29 of 41 for 391 yards and 4 touchdowns. So, I mean, he's had some of those performances, and he doesn't have the turnover issues that Tyler Buchner had. I still think that if Tyler Buchner doesn't get injured, he has a completely different career. And we saw the potential he has against South Carolina in the Gator Bowl, but he just missed so much development because of the injuries. Riley didn't have that same sort of missed development time. He got that full year as a starter in year number 2 and continued to show improvement week after week after week. So, he's a guy that can make plays in the throwing game. He can make plays with the RPO game. He can make plays on the move. He's a guy that can attack the perimeter of the defense with his throwing ability. The big key is going to be, can he throw the ball down the field? That's the key. And they're going to have maybe 4 or 5 opportunities to hit big shots in this game. And it's the same thing I said last year when they played Clemson. They're going to have about 4 or 5 shots to throw the ball down the field. Can you design them correctly, and can the quarterback hit them? And Notre Dame couldn't do it against Clemson last year. They couldn't do it against Ohio State last year. Can Riley Leonard hit those shots? That's going to be a big part of determining if Notre Dame can get those chunk plays. Because, what you're not going to do against this A&M defense, Mark, in my opinion, is you're just not going to put together a bunch of 8, 9, 10 play drives. We just run the ball down their throat and just control the clock. I mean, even before Mike Elko showed up, this was a pretty good run defense last season from Texas A&M. I mean, even with all the issues that they had last year as a team and all the disappointment, things along those lines, this is still a team that ranked 14th in the country last year in rush defense and ranked 18th in the country last year in fewest yards allowed per attempt. They're going to be better this year with Mike Elko and his staff running the show, although I do wonder why he hired Jay Bateman as his D coordinator, but I have to think that he's going to have a much bigger say over that than maybe, he would have if you're just hiring somebody else as your defensive coordinator. But I think that's going to be a key for Riley Leonard. He's a guy that has shown the ability to have big games throwing the ball. Can he do it consistently? We'll find out. The one thing he's going to have, though, is he's going to have a much better supporting cast than he had at Duke. I mean, from a running back standpoint, and he actually had good running backs at Duke, much better wide receivers, obviously a stud tight end. Mike Elko talked about that today. He's like, I'm very familiar with Mitchell Evans. Mitchell Evans had 7 catches for 134 yards against Duke last year. And again, he was their offense against Duke last year until Audric broke that big run at the end. But he's going to be very, very familiar with what this, with what this Notre Dame team is going to have. He's going to have a lot more weapons to work with. You can't just shut Riley Leonard down. At Duke, you say if you can stop Riley Leonard, got a pretty good shot at stopping Duke. If your focus is on stopping Riley Leonard at Notre Dame, it's like, okay, but how do you do that and stop Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price in the backfield and Mitchell Evans at tight end and Chris Mitchell and Jaden Greathouse and Bo Collins and Jaden Thomas and Jordan Faison and guys like that at wide receiver? It's a different animal than what you had to do when you were trying to prepare against him when he was at Duke.
Brian, I don't want to put these two players on completely different levels. I'll get your assessment here. But on Saturday, did we see in Haynes King a slightly poor man's Riley Leonard?
Yes, I think as a runner, very similar. I would say Riley's probably a tad faster, but very similar. 6'4", long, instinctive runner, natural runner. Even something simple like, do you remember that run he had? I think it was on a second or third down. And it was like second and 10, third and 10. And he starts to run outside, and the guy for A&M has an angle on him. So he just little slight bounce. And that little slight bounce allows him to outrun the defense to the sideline and get into a short yardage situation. And he's just instinctive as a runner. And Riley's instinctive as a runner as well. And he's fast. I mean, you go watch the touchdown run he had against Clemson last year where he breaks a tackle in the backfield on 3rd and 4 near midfield and then just outruns the defense to the end zone. That's a Clemson defense that had some guys who can run. So very similar. Where I would say that the biggest difference is Riley is a more natural thrower, much quicker release. Haynes King has a bit of a longer release, a little bit of a shot put at times, not super accurate, and he turns the ball over a ton. He had 16 picks last year. Riley Leonard doesn't turn the ball over as much. Now, part of that is he played in a very conservative offense at Duke. He's going to play in a more aggressive offense at Notre Dame, but he's a guy that protects the ball. So as athletes, as runners, as dual threat guys, very, very similar. The biggest difference is I believe Riley Leonard has a much more impressive track record as a thrower and what he can do from the pocket, and that's still part of Haynes King's game that is still needing work. Although he protected the ball pretty well against Florida State on Saturday. That's a big part of that game. He didn't have those bad turnovers that would get them in trouble at times last year. And I think we threw 16 picks last year.
Yeah.
Protected the ball well on Saturday, and that's something that helped them, win that football game.
You got to hear from Mike Elko. Brian gave his assessment. Also watched the news conference today. Was there anything that the coach said that made you think a little different about his football team?
Yeah, nothing crazy. I mean, I think maybe the biggest thing is that he feels like they're really good from a health standpoint. This has been a team that going in the last few seasons has been pretty banged up, and certainly they lost a key player in running back Reuben Owens. But other than that, pretty good shape. Still a lot of positions that they're not ready yet to say that, hey, this guy's a starter here, this guy's a starter here. Gave out a depth chart. There was a lot of oars in the depth chart, as you can expect. So still a lot to play out there.
I'm going to ask one question and get out of the way, and you and Brian can mix it up on some football talk. Because like I said to Brian, when I look at both offensive lines against both defensive fronts, then it makes me think, okay, what are we going to have, like 14 total yards in the first half of this game? Like, who's going to move who out of the way? Because you've been on a couple times in the offseason to tell me about the issues that A&M had last year and then moving into this year. And one of the reasons Connor Wigman couldn't finish the season is because of a missed block. So your thoughts about A&M up front against Notre Dame's front?
Me first or Brian?
Yeah, you first, Carter.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think you look at this game and you're spot on. This is probably going to be a very low scoring game. Could be a rock fight because both offensive lines are kind of at a disadvantage for Texas A&M. They're going up against a pretty talented Notre Dame defensive line headlined by Howard Cross, an All-American, and A&M's offensive line's been probably the biggest weakness of the team the last couple of years. I expect them to be better this year, but how much better is kind of the question. And really the two spots that are of concern right now are at center and right tackle. They're not quite decided just yet. I think right tackle is maybe a little bit more of a concern because I think A&M thought that they had a surefire starter there in Ruben Fothery, but there's been some competition there this camp. They've thought about moving the Kansas transfer, Armaj Reed-Adams, to right tackle. So that wasn't the best of signs. And then at center, they brought in a Utah transfer, Koli Fayu, who has been battling for a spot there. So I feel like they feel great about the left side of the line, but the right side of the line is where it kind of gets tricky for A&M. And then on the other side, and Brian can certainly speak to this, Notre Dame's had their issues up front, has some inexperience there, and A&M's biggest strength is its defensive line. So definitely two advantages that both teams should have is up front on that defensive line.
It's all yours, Brian, if you guys want to kick into gear here.
I mean, obviously that's the storylines coming into this game, right? It's two really good defensive lines. I think Notre Dame's is not doesn't get as much I don't say respect. I think that's an easy, like kind of a lazy term to use. As much recognition for being as good on the D line as what A&M gets, partly because of how good they were last year. And then, of course, you had Nick Scourton, who was, in my opinion, the best defensive lineman on the market coming in the portal this year, and a guy that was very productive in that Purdue defense. And so you understand it. I don't know that Notre Dame's defensive line gets as much of the national publicity, but it's a very good group. And so which one, carries the day? You talked about the left side of the A&M line. Obviously, Chase Basantis was a freshman All-American last year. Trey Zune's a guy that played. Notre Dame is a little bit more solid on the right side, even though that Emil Wagner's not a guy that played really any meaningful snaps last year. He beat out a guy that started the bowl game in a game where they had 456 yards and 236 rushing yards and scored 40 points. And as I was kind of discussing with somebody today, part of the reason Notre Dame enters the season with only 6 career starts is because they had a guy with 4 career starts, 13 career starts, and 10 career starts get beat out in fall camp by younger, more talented players. And so that's why I go back to what I said earlier, Marcus. What's going to carry the day for Notre Dame? Is it the talent or is it the experience? Whichever's the bigger storyline is going to determine how well Notre Dame plays, because it's not about whipping A&M. It's about holding your own. That's the key, because where I think Notre Dame could have an advantage in this matchup is their offensive skill players against an A&M secondary that is going to look way different than it did a year ago outside of Tyreek Chappell and Bryce Anderson, right? Those are really the only 2 guys that played a ton last year. You've got a bunch of other guys that are transfers in, and this is what we don't know. This is the great unknown in modern football, guys, is you don't know how teams that are relying on a lot of transfers are going to look. Last year, Florida State didn't miss a beat with all those transfers. This year, they didn't look like the same team with all those transfers. So you just don't know how teams are going to come together, because football is such a sport where you have to have everybody kind of working in the same direction. And just because the portal worked for you in one year doesn't mean it will work for you the next, and vice versa. The portal worked great for Lincoln Riley in 2022. It was horrible for Lincoln Riley in 2023. You just never know. So how are those A&M guys going to be in the secondary? And then the flip side is, well, yeah, but isn't like half of Notre Dame's receiving core new guys? Exactly. Right. That's the interesting part about it. Although I think it's a bigger issue on defense because there's so much more communication. I've got to know what the free's doing and the strong's doing, the nickel's doing, the corner's doing, receivers. Like, I just got to know my route and I got to know what I need to do. So that's a matchup that's going to be very interesting. And then the other side too is if Notre Dame can get pressure on Connor Wegman, he's going to struggle completing the ball at a high level because you've got one of the best secondaries in college football coming back. If you can't get to him, the one thing A&M has is they have big boys outside, right, Carter? I mean, you've seen it. I mean, yes. if you can give those guys time, there's 6'5", 6 inches they have on opposing cornerbacks. And that's where you can kind of get some of those deep shots off over the middle of the field where they can use their size to their advantage. So that's another interesting aspect that's going to tell me a lot, is Notre Dame's skill in the secondary is better than what A&M has a receiver, in my opinion. But sometimes, man, size can overcome that lack of skill in that matchup if your quarterback has time to let those routes develop where they can become more vertical one-on-one. So that's the other part of this matchup, is if Notre Dame can't get pressure on the quarterback, can Notre Dame's secondary hold up against a much bigger group of receivers than they've faced a lot? They did a good job last year against Ohio State. They shut down their big receivers, but you're going to need to put pressure on the quarterback and not give them those chances to develop those downfield throws.
Yeah, that's kind of, I mean, we talked about the offensive line versus defensive line. I think that's actually what the big advantage is for Notre Dame, is their secondary versus Texas A&M skill guys. Because I think you could argue that A&M skill guys are a bigger weakness than its offensive line going into this year. I mean, you look at their wide receiver group, none of those guys have had 700-plus yards in a season at a Power 5 school. Running backs, none of them have had 600 yards in a season. Tight ends, none of them have had 400 yards in a season. So they don't really have like a proven number one option really at either group. You thought Donovan Green could be that at tight end, but coming off an ACL tear, put on some weight. I don't know if he's quite there yet. But yeah, I think you look at a guy like Noah Thomas for Texas A&M. You mentioned the length. He's 6'6", definitely that guy you can kind of throw it up to, and he can come down with it in traffic, brings that large catch radius. He's kind of that guy you look to as a potential number one receiver. His biggest issue has been staying healthy. When we've seen him on the field, you could see those flashes, but over the last couple of years, he has really battled through quite a few injuries. I think drops is an issue for the group too. Jade Walker led the group with 7 drops last year. Cyrus Allen, the Louisiana Tech transfer, had some drop issues previously. So I think Connor Wigman has the potential to be an excellent quarterback. I mean, obviously, we've seen some first-round projections for him in the upcoming draft. Certainly has to prove it this year. He hasn't had that sample size of a career so far. He's only had 8 starts so far. But when we've seen him play, he is definitely the kind of guy who can elevate the talent around him. So, obviously, he'll be a key component as well. I just keep going back to defensively for Texas A&M. Defensive line can help your back end, and I know A&M that's going to be a big question for them. They've got 10 newcomers in the secondary, 7 of whom are transfers. So a lot of new faces back there. But if you watch this secondary last year, they could not have been much worse. They really struggled against the better passing offenses that they faced. And I felt like they really did a great job in the transfer portal, getting a mixture of guys who were either potential guys like, man, this guy could be really good one day, like a Des Ricks, former 5-star recruit at Alabama. They got guys who could contribute right away, like Will Lee, who was a starter for Kansas State last year and should be in the mix this season. And then guys who just simply have experience but came from smaller schools like Donovan Saunders and BJ Mays from UAB. And I also think they moved some guys in the right places. Bryce Anderson, I think, has the potential to be an all-SEC caliber player, but last year played at nickel, wasn't really the right fit for him. And now he's at safety, and they feel like that move can really enhance this secondary. But, again, when you have an elite defensive line, which I think A&M will have, that helps everybody else out. We mentioned Nick Scorton up front, led the Big Ten in sacks last year, but I also think Shamar Turner is someone to mention. Second team All-SEC last year, despite playing out of position at defensive end, and despite having 2 injuries that required surgery in the shin and a torn labrum. Now he's moved inside to defensive tackle. He's healthy, and I think he could be a guy that you could see drafted in the 1st or 2nd round next year. And then also Shamar Stewart, another guy, former 5-star recruit. You watch him last season, he had 1.5 sacks. Really could have had like 7 or 8. He had a lot of near misses that could have ended up being sacks. Now he's in that starting featured role. A lot of the attention's going to be on Nick Scorton, but if Shamar Stewart had a couple sacks this Saturday, I wouldn't be shocked, because I think he's that kind of player who could also play himself into being a high draft pick. So you got 3 guys up front that you feel like could be draft picks, and behind them you've got 4- and 5-star recruits. You got Cassius Howell, who tied for the lead in sacks in the MAC last year. And so there's just a lot of guys you can throw out there, not just in your base, but also in 3rd and long, that can make this defense a real B word to deal with.
They weren't losing games last year because of their defense. I mean, that's the reality. Yeah. And they've got some talented guys coming back, right? Like that's both of these teams, right? Like Notre Dame didn't lose games last year because their defense didn't show up. They lost games last year because their offense didn't show up in those big moments. They didn't lose to Ohio State because their defense. Yeah, their defense had a chance to close it, and that's going to be – just forget this game, just looking at the season. That's going to be what's going to determine, in my opinion, and Carter, you can correct me if you disagree with this one, but it's how the offenses evolve in their under these 2 coordinators who were both part of high octane top 10 caliber scoring offenses last year. How do they adjust? How do the players adjust to that? And can they play well in those bigger moments? And that's where Notre Dame's offense struggled last year, and that's where A&M struggled. I mean, they gave They gave LSU one of their tougher games in the regular season as far as keeping them in check, at least for a half, right? And it was hard to keep that offense in check for 60 minutes.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where Notre Dame was, is whose offense this year is going to really step up. And that's going to be the key for A&M, and that's going to be the key for Notre Dame is you've got a great defense. You've got a defense that gives you a chance to go win a lot of games for Notre Dame. The question is, can your offense match it? Can your offense step up and play better in those big moments? And Carter, you remember this when you were on the beat. That's been the story of Notre Dame for a decade. Yeah. It's, can the offense show up when the games matter most? And that's what you brought Mike Denbrock back in to do, is to do exactly that. And now we're going to find out if he can get it done.
Yep.
Is Vegas making – go ahead, Carter.
Oh, I was going to say, your turn, Mark. You got it.
Well, I was going to say, is Vegas making a football evaluation, or are they latching on to old narratives? Notre Dame, big game, on the road, against an SEC opponent, difficult place to play. I'm not saying that Texas A&M isn't worthy of this game and that Notre Dame's significantly better, because I don't believe that, but I'm seeing a Notre Dame team that I believe is somewhat better. I think that they're a top 7 or 8 team in the country, and maybe Texas A&M's more in that top 15 to 20 range. But we've got a situation where Notre Dame's roughly a 2.5 to 3 point dog.
Could you imagine the money that would go in on Texas A&M if Notre Dame was the favorite? I mean, that's the reality of it, is there's no respect in the SEC. Like, here's the storyline if Notre Dame wins it. If Notre Dame wins this game, the storyline will be like, hey, Notre Dame's better than we thought it was. It will be, Texas A&M's not as good. They're overrated again. That's what it'll be. It's not going to be because Notre Dame. In my opinion, again, I'm not a gambler, but this is my opinion, that this is the line that they had to have to try to make the money spread even as much as they could. Because Texas, if Notre Dame was a road favorite against A&M, who in Texas is voting or is going to bet against Notre Dame, or against Texas A&M? So I think it has more to do with that, and the fact that there's still a perception out there that Notre Dame can't win these games. I would argue that Texas A&M is probably closer to NC State, North Carolina right now as a team than they are to Ohio State or Georgia. But that's really what it comes down to. Notre Dame has to go show that they can go on the road and win these games, and they just haven't done enough of that. They didn't do it last year against Clemson. They didn't do it last year against Louisville. They didn't do it in 2022 at USC. They didn't do it in 2022 against Ohio State. And I think that's a big part of it as well. But again, I would argue that those teams in 22 were better teams than what A&M will be in game 1 of this season. But, if you want to have people stop doubting you, then start winning these games more consistently. That's what it boils down to.
Yeah.
Brian, I'm sorry, Carter. Go to it.
I think it's a combination of two other things too. One, you're playing in Kyle Field, one of the toughest environments to play. I mean, EA Sports has them number 1. I don't know if they're number 1, but definitely top 10 in my mind. Not to mention you're playing in that humid, hot heat that Notre Dame may not be accustomed to as much. But really also they lose their starting left tackle and Charles Jagusaw. And now, it was, we like Josh Baker. Just kidding. We like another guy now. And I just think that uncertainty.
They were a dog, though, before Charles got hurt, though. They've been a dog the entire time. It just went by half a point further when Charles got hurt.
Right. But I still think that's why it hasn't moved the other direction, and why it's kind of stayed there and really only continue to go in A&M's favor are those two things. Because I think earlier this offseason, A&M was, I think A&M's been a favorite the whole offseason. I could be wrong on that.
I think it's been like 1.5 to 3. It's been somewhere in that range.
If it was at Notre Dame would probably be the favorite. If Charles Jagusaw was healthy too. So it could be that. I mean, don't they say that home field advantage usually gives you 3 points? So I think that probably has a role to play in it as well.
So unless Brian has anything else, Carter, I'm going to hit you with one more item here before we let you go. And we so much appreciate you stopping by. And before we do, Gig'em 247, everyone. Carter, what do you have available for everyone there at Gig'em 247?
Yeah, just content throughout this week on A&M Notre Dame. Just posted a story on the connection between Mike Elko and Riley Leonard. Going to have a couple features later this week, and you can find our podcast on YouTube as well at Gig'em247.
Awesome. Carter, what's a good season for Texas A&M?
Yeah, I think this season's going to be graded on a curve a little bit, because I think if you asked anyone around this program, it's not a rebuild. You think about firing a coach and what that does to you. A&M was able to not only retain a lot of the top guys from last year outside of a few, they also got, a lot of talented transfers, fourth-ranked transfer class. And then you look at this schedule, and it's pretty favorable. Your 4 toughest games are all at home. You don't have to play Bama, Georgia, or Ole Miss. So I think the expectations for the season, making the college football playoff, I think, is a little too much to put on them. But I think 9 wins would be a good season for them to have. Go 9-3, win all the games you're supposed to win. I think Vegas has them favored in all but the Texas game right now. Now, that doesn't mean they need to go 11-1 for it to be successful. I think 9-3 is a good year. We learned under Kevin Sumlin that 8-4 is not a season that A&M fans accept. But 9 wins, that has not been done in the regular season very much by A&M in recent memory. So I think that'd be a nice year that Mike Elko could build off of.
Yeah, Texas A&M fans have had their fill of 8-5 after the bowl game between Sumlin and Fisher. That's for sure. Carter, we appreciate you stopping by. It's great to hear from you, and you added so much to the discussion. So thanks for getting us straight on Texas A&M.
Yes, sir. Appreciate y'all having me. Good seeing you again,
Good
Brian.
seeing you, Carter. Hey, Notre Dame fans, if you want to get some honest assessment of A&M in this game from an A&M side of view, go follow Carter. He does a really good job. Known him for a while. Really does a good job. Good, fair, decent, good job. Good journalist. Check him out.
Absolutely. You see the X handle right there. Carter Corrals. It's easy to find right there, and Gig'em 247 Sports as well. Thanks, Carter. Good to see you.
Well, guys, thank y'all.